Greetings, wanderers. Tonight, we drift back to ancient Rome, where culinary landscape were filled with creativity to the point of insanity. Emperors served 600 ostrich brains at teenage dinner parties. Wealthy citizens paid 3 years of soldier wages for a bottle of rotten fish sauce. Influencers flexed with flamingo tongues and extinct spices, and the riches poisoned themselves with lead-sweetened wine for social status. If these stories bring you comfort and peace of mind, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. And before you drift away, do leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I'm always curious how these old stories find you. Very well, it's time we settle in, dim the lights, and discover what crazy food is on the menu. Congratulations, you just woke up in ancient Rome's absolute nightmare, or as some call it, entertainment. You are living under the reign of Elagabalus, a teenage emperor with unlimited budget and zero adult supervision. He is the most powerful person in the known world, and what does he do with this power? He throws dinner parties featuring 600 ostrich brains. Not the meat, not the eggs, just the brains, from 600 ostriches. The teenage emperor killed insane amounts of African birds just to serve their brains to dinner guests. Imagine the logistics, the planning, the sheer waste of it all. Each ostrich brain was about the size of a golf ball, and Elagabalus wanted them all for one evening of showing off. The emperor didn't stop there. He created chef punishment contests where the losers had to eat only failed ostrich brain preparations. He mixed gold flakes and pearls into the food, literally eating the imperial treasury. His excess shocked even jaded Roman aristocrats who were already accustomed to luxury. We're talking about a culture where wealthy people regularly bought flamingo tongues from Africa just to eat the small muscle and throw away the rest of the bird. But Elagabalus wasn't even the worst offender when it came to Roman food madness. Wealthy Romans routinely paid 4,000 sesterces for a single amphora of premium garum, their beloved fish sauce. That's more than 3 years of soldier pay for what was essentially fermented fish guts. Imagine spending $60,000 on a bottle of fish sauce instead of buying a Rolex or a Tesla. The Romans did this regularly, and they considered it completely normal. Garum was made from fish intestines, blood, and salt, fermented in the sun for months until it became a putrid brown liquid. The smell was so overwhelming that garum factories were banned from cities. Workers lived in separate downwind communities because nobody could tolerate the stench. And yet Romans paid fortunes for this rotten fish sauce, using it like we use ketchup today. Even more insane, they literally ate an entire plant species into extinction just because it tasted good. Silphium, a herb that grew only in a narrow strip of Libya, was so prized by Roman gourmets that they harvested it faster than it could reproduce. This wasn't just any herb, it was the ultimate luxury ingredient. Julius Caesar kept 1,500 pounds of silphium in the Roman treasury as a strategic reserve, right alongside gold and silver. It was worth its weight in precious metals. The Romans knew silphium was becoming rare. They tried to cultivate it elsewhere, but failed. They watched the wild populations dwindle year after year, and still they kept harvesting, cooking, and eating their way through every last plant. Pliny, the elder, recorded that the final stalk was sent to Emperor Nero, who ate it immediately. Not saved for study, not preserved for breeding, just consumed on the spot. The world's first recorded extinction caused entirely by luxury dining. Meanwhile, wealthy Romans were slowly poisoning themselves with their favorite beverage enhancement. They sweetened wine with lead acetate, which they called sugar of lead. The lead made wine taste incredibly sweet and smooth, so naturally they assumed it was healthy. Roman aristocrats consumed dangerous amounts of lead daily, thinking they were being sophisticated wine connoisseurs. Modern chemists recreated Roman lead-sweetened wine using ancient methods and found levels up to 1,000 milligrams of lead per liter. 1 teaspoon contained enough lead to cause chronic poisoning. Romans showed classic symptoms of lead toxicity, including dementia, infertility, and organ failure, but they never connected it to their fancy wine. They kept drinking, kept poisoning themselves, all in the name of having the sweetest possible vintage. So why did Roman food culture become so absolutely unhinged? The answer comes down to social warfare mixed with magical thinking, amplified by unlimited resources. Roman dinner parties weren't just meals, they were competitions where your menu determined your social ranking. Serving chicken meant you were a nobody. Flamingo tongues were the minimum standard for maintaining aristocratic status. The dinner table became a battlefield where Romans fought with increasingly exotic ingredients instead of weapons. Every host tried to outdo the previous party with more expensive, more unusual, more shocking food choices. At the same time, Romans genuinely believed that eating exotic animals transferred their powers to the consumer. Want to be more eloquent? Eat flamingo tongues because flamingos are brightly colored and eye-catching. Need enhanced intelligence? Peacock brains, obviously, because peacocks have beautiful displays. Seeking protection from disease. Camel heels, because camels survive in harsh desert conditions. This wasn't metaphorical. Romans truly thought they could absorb animal qualities through consumption. These two factors combined with Rome's 3-continent reach created the perfect storm for culinary insanity. When you can import anything from anywhere, when you believe eating rare animals will enhance your personal qualities, and when your social status depends entirely on serving the most outrageous menu possible, you end up with the most extreme food culture in human history. Roman wealth and influence made the impossible look mundane. They could ship live flamingos from Africa, maintain pools of live moray eels, and create specialized farms for fattening dormice in clay jars. Money was no object when reputation was at stake. This was merely the first bite. The full feast of Roman culinary madness begins now, and it only gets stranger. Remember those flamingo tongues mentioned earlier? You might think, what's the big deal? They're just birds. But when you understand what it actually took to get those bright pink tongues onto Roman dinner tables, the true madness becomes clear. Romans were importing massive pink birds from the remote salt lakes of Africa. Creatures that thrive on lakes of poison, where few animals larger than the plankton they eat can survive. These birds stride comfortably through boiling brine and lay eggs inches from gaseous fumes. The logistics alone of transporting live flamingos across the Mediterranean, keeping them healthy during days to possibly weeks depending on the wind, all for one small piece of anatomy, reveals the depths of Roman obsession with status food. Pliny the Elder confirmed that flamingo tongues had the most exquisite flavor according to Apicius, the most gluttonous gorger of all spendthrifts, who established the view that the flamingo's tongue has a specially fine flavor. This wasn't just some rich person's random opinion that polite society ignored. When Apicius declared flamingo tongues divine in his cookbook, every wealthy Roman suddenly needed to serve them at dinner parties or face complete social destruction. His recipes became the blueprint for luxury dining across the empire. And flamingo tongues represented the ultimate expression of refined taste and unlimited wealth. Romans imported these massive pink birds from Africa just to eat the tongues and discard everything else like expensive garbage. Think about that level of shocking waste. A single flamingo weighs around 8 pounds, stands 4 feet tall, has gorgeous pink and white plumage that could be used for decoration. and contains plenty of perfectly edible meat. But Romans considered only the small tongue muscle worthy of their refined palates. Everything else, the beautiful feathers, the long, elegant legs, the bulk of nutritious meat, was thrown away as worthless trash. It's like buying a luxury car, taking out the steering wheel, and throwing away the rest of it. Having a roast phenicopterus, meaning scarlet wing, on the table was a status symbol and a means of flaunting one's riches that few could match. Only the small tongue muscle was considered worthy of consumption, which reveals the incredible depths of Roman pickiness about food. The flamingo tongue itself is large and fleshy, filling most of the bird's oral cavity, about 4 to 6 inches long. What made it special was its unique anatomy. Flamingos have a wide, flat, serrated tongue covered with bristle-like projections called lamellae, which they use for filter feeding. The tongue also contains a rectal tissue to help with eating, giving it a distinctive texture and substantial feel. People who used to eat flamingo tongues described their unique anatomy. The pink color was considered magical by Romans who associated vibrant colors with divine power and supernatural abilities. This wasn't just aesthetic preference or artistic appreciation. Romans genuinely believed that brightly colored foods contained more spiritual energy than ordinary brown or gray ingredients. The flamingo's pink came from their diet of tiny crustaceans and algae. Their naturally white feathers changed to pink through this consumption. Romans saw this transformation from white to brilliant pink as proof of the bird's magical properties. They thought consuming something so visually striking and unnaturally colored would transfer that luminous divine quality directly to the person eating it, making their own presence more commanding and memorable. Marshall described flamingo farms near Naples specifically established for tongue harvesting operations alongside other exotic livestock. This wasn't just occasional hunting expeditions into African wetlands. Roman entrepreneurs invested in maintaining these exotic bird operations. But the profits from selling flamingo tongues to wealthy Romans made it worthwhile for enterprising businessmen. Romans believed flamingo tongues granted eloquence and enhanced speaking abilities through sympathetic magic, which made them especially popular among senators, lawyers, and public speakers. The reasoning seemed perfectly logical to Roman minds. Flamingos are naturally eye-catching and commanding when they move in large flocks across African landscapes, their bright pink color visible from great distances on a clear day. So eating their tongues would obviously make your speeches equally compelling, memorable, and persuasive to audiences. Roman politicians paid premium prices for flamingo tongue dinners before important speeches, legal cases, or Senate debates. Completely convinced this exotic delicacy would give them supernatural rhetorical advantages over their opponents. Marshall even wrote from the flamingo's perspective, saying, "My red wing gives me my name, but epicures regard my tongue as tasty. But what if my tongue could sing?" adding poetic irony to the consumption of these magnificent creatures for their supposed vocal enhancement properties. Peacock ranked first class in Apicius' cookbook, above lobster and imported fish, which reveals just how much Romans valued these elaborate birds. This wasn't arbitrary ranking based on availability or cost alone. Apicius specifically placed peacock at the top of his luxury food hierarchy, declaring that peacock preparations occupy the first rank among all meat dishes, provided they be dressed in such a manner that the hard and tough parts become tender. When it came to meatballs, Apicius ranked peacock first, then pheasant, then rabbit, then chicken, with tender young pork ranking fifth. Having a roast peacock on the table was a status symbol and a means of flaunting one's riches that only the wealthy could afford. The cookbook dedicated multiple recipes to peacock preparation, treating it as the ultimate expression of culinary sophistication and wealth. Romans sought peacock brains, believing they enhanced intelligence and decision-making abilities through the same magical thinking they applied to flamingo tongues. The logic was straightforward in Roman minds. Peacocks displayed extraordinary intelligence in their elaborate mating rituals, their ability to predict weather changes, and their complex social behaviors. Therefore, consuming their brains would obviously transfer these cognitive abilities to the person eating them. Wealthy Romans paid premium prices for peacock brain courses, convinced they were literally eating intelligence and wisdom. The more colorful the bird, the more magical properties Romans attributed to brain consumption. Romans thinking colorful birds had more magic is like believing flashy sports cars are faster. Peacocks represented the pinnacle of this belief system because of their iridescent tail feathers that shimmer with blues, greens, and golds. Romans saw these shifting colors as proof of supernatural power contained within the bird's body. Male peacocks with the most vibrant displays commanded the highest prices for their brains. Since Romans believed the intensity of color directly correlated with the strength of magical enhancement they would receive. Peacock brain was mixed with honey and expensive spices for maximum magical effect, creating elaborate preparations that combined multiple luxury ingredients. Roman cooks didn't simply serve raw or plain cooked peacock brain. They created complex recipes that incorporated imported honey from Greece, exotic spices from India, and rare herbs from across the empire. The preparation itself became part of the magical ritual, with each expensive ingredient supposedly amplifying the brain's natural power enhancement properties. Dinner guests competed over who got the peacock brain course during elaborate banquets, turning the serving into a social hierarchy display. The host would carefully choose which guests received peacock brain based on their social ranking, political importance, or personal favor. Being served peacock brain was a public declaration of your status within Roman high society. Not receiving it was a subtle but devastating social snub that could damage relationships and political alliances. Emperor Vitellius took this competition to insane extremes with his Shield of Minerva dish, which cost 100,000 sesterces, a Roman soldier's lifetime salary. It contained peacock and pheasant brains alongside flamingo tongues, pike liver, and lamprey blood. That makes today's $500 tasting menus look reasonable. Archaeological evidence confirms this obsession, with peacock bones found showing clear brain extraction marks, where Roman cooks carefully removed the skulls to access the precious brain tissue. Religious ceremonies used peacocks instead of chickens for divine favor, demonstrating how Romans elevated these birds to sacred status. Traditional Roman religious practices called for chicken sacrifices to the gods, but wealthy Romans substituted peacocks, believing their superior beauty and intelligence made them more pleasing offerings. Emperor Elagabalus was particularly notorious for offering these costly birds in sacrifice to the gods when a regular old chicken would have done just fine. He served to palace attendants huge platters heaped up with the heads of parrots, pheasants, and peacocks, creating grotesque displays of wealth and power. Priests conducted elaborate ceremonies where peacock brains were offered to specific deities associated with wisdom and beauty, particularly Minerva and Venus. Peacock preparation was elaborate, with plumage removed, the bird roasted whole, then feathers stuck back with honey for dramatic presentation. This wasn't just cooking, it was theatrical performance designed to amaze dinner guests. Roman cooks developed specialized techniques for removing every feather without damaging the skin, requiring multiple servants and hours of careful work. The process demanded expert knowledge of peacock anatomy and precise timing to achieve the perfect roast, while maintaining the structural integrity needed for feather reattachment. The final result looked like a living peacock resting on the dinner table, creating gasps of amazement from impressed guests. Despite all this elaborate presentation, peacock actually tasted like chicken, proving it was all style, no substance. Multiple Roman sources noted the irony that peacocks, despite their extraordinary beauty and enormous cost, had rather ordinary flavor. The meat was often tough and required extensive preparation to become palatable. Romans were essentially paying fortunes and creating elaborate rituals around a bird that offered no superior taste experience compared to common poultry. The entire peacock obsession was pure social theater designed to display wealth and sophistication rather than actual culinary enjoyment. Remember Elagabalus, the teenage emperor who killed 600 ostriches for one dinner party? Let's dive deeper into that spectacular madness, because the details reveal just how unhinged Roman luxury dining could become. This wasn't gradual accumulation over multiple events or careful harvesting of available birds. Elagabalus ordered the slaughter of hundreds of massive African birds in a single day, all to serve their brains as party snacks to dinner guests who probably couldn't even finish them all. Each ostrich brain was about the size of a golf ball, meaning the emperor needed 600 golf ball-sized portions for one evening of showing off his unlimited power and resources. The logistics alone were staggering, requiring specialized hunters, massive transport operations, and teams of cooks working around the clock to prepare hundreds of ostrich brain dishes before they spoiled in the Mediterranean heat. The teenage emperor controlled the entire Roman Empire's treasury, with no one powerful enough to stop his extravagant spending sprees. At age 14, Elagabalus had advisors and senators too intimidated by his imperial authority to refuse his increasingly bizarre and expensive food demands. Nobody possessed the courage or political power to tell the emperor no when he decided he wanted hundreds of ostrich brains for dinner, regardless of the astronomical cost or environmental impact. The combination of absolute political power, teenage impulsiveness, unlimited wealth, and complete lack of oversight created an environment where no food excess was too extreme or expensive. Elagabalus organized cooking competitions, where chefs who botched ostrich brain recipes were forced to consume their own failures in front of laughing dinner guests. This wasn't simply firing incompetent cooks, reducing their wages, or demoting them to lower kitchen positions. The emperor turned culinary disasters into public spectacle, making failed cooks eat incorrectly seasoned, overcooked, or improperly prepared ostrich brain dishes while aristocrats watched and mocked them. Professional kitchen staff found themselves choking down ruined ostrich brain preparations because they had failed to meet the emperor's exacting standards for this expensive delicacy. The emperor mixed gold flakes and crushed pearls directly into the food, turning Rome's wealth into edible luxury one extravagant dinner party at a time. Elagabalus didn't just spend enormous amounts of money on expensive ingredients imported from across the empire. He incorporated actual currency, precious metals, and rare gems directly into the meals themselves, creating dishes that contained more wealth than most Romans would see in multiple lifetimes. Gold leaf-covered ostrich brain dishes, crushed pearls seasoned exotic sauces, and rare jewels decorated serving platters that were consumed along with the food itself. Dinner guests weren't just eating expensive meals prepared with costly ingredients. They were literally consuming Rome's strategic reserves of precious metals, stones, and currency that should have funded military campaigns and public infrastructure projects for decades. Elagabalus's ostrich brain excess disturbed even wealthy Roman aristocrats who were already accustomed to luxury dining and outrageous displays of personal wealth at elaborate banquets. These were sophisticated people who regularly consumed flamingo tongues imported from Africa, peacock brains prepared with honey and exotic spices, and dormice fattened in special clay jars. They considered themselves worldly connoisseurs of expensive food and elaborate entertainment. Having attended countless extravagant parties featuring the most unusual ingredients available throughout the empire. But even these experienced luxury diners found Elagabalus's ostrich brain spectacles deeply disturbing and excessive, proving that the teenage emperor had crossed social and financial lines that even seasoned Roman party hosts wouldn't dare approach, regardless of their personal wealth or social status. The emperor genuinely believed that consuming ostrich brains provided enhanced strength, speed, and physical power due to the bird's massive size and impressive athletic abilities across African desert landscapes. Elagabalus followed the same belief system that drove other Romans to eat flamingo tongues for eloquence and peacock brains for enhanced intelligence and decision-making abilities. Ostriches represented the ultimate expression of physical dominance in the animal kingdom, standing 8 feet tall, weighing over 300 pounds, and running faster than the finest horses in the imperial stables. Therefore, consuming their brains would obviously transfer that imposing physical presence, incredible speed, and raw athletic power directly to whoever ate them, making Elagabalus feel more physically intimidating and martially capable when facing his political subjects, military enemies, and potential rivals for imperial control. Parrot heads served as conversation pieces at Roman banquets, with Elagabalus serving heads of parrots, pheasants, and peacocks on huge platters to palace attendants. The cookbook Apicius features a recipe for flamingo in spiced date sauce, with a note that parrot is served the same way, indicating Romans had developed identical cooking methods for both birds. Romans believed eating talking birds would enhance their own speech abilities through sympathetic magic. The logic seemed sound to Roman minds. If parrots could learn and repeat human words, then consuming their heads would transfer that linguistic ability to the eater. Different bird species commanded different prices based on their rarity and supposed magical properties throughout the Roman Empire. According to Apicius, peacock was among first-rank dishes, outranking rabbit, lobster, chicken, and pork in luxury. When it came to meatballs, Apicius ranked peacock first, then pheasant, then rabbit, then chicken, with tender young pork meatballs ranking 5th. Wealthy Romans developed hierarchies of exotic birds with peacocks at the absolute top, followed by flamingos, then various other species based on their color intensity, size, and availability from distant provinces. Romans competed at dinner parties by serving increasingly rare bird species, turning their menus into social competitions, where the most exotic birds demonstrated superior wealth and sophistication among aristocratic circles. Cockscombs and duck tongues were harvested for virility enhancement, with Elagabalus eating cockscombs taken from the living birds, and the tongues of peacocks and nightingales, because he was told that one who ate them was immune from the plague. The tongues of nightingales and peacocks were treasured food items specifically sought for their supposed enhancement properties. All manner of bird tongues were loved by those who could afford them, with Romans believing consuming these parts would transfer sexual power and masculine energy to the person eating them. Duck tongues are still eaten as a delicacy today, showing this Roman practice survived in some form through the centuries. Crane and turtle dove recipes appeared in Apicius alongside flamingo preparations, demonstrating that Romans developed sophisticated cooking techniques for virtually every exotic bird available throughout their vast empire. The book has sauces for crane, turtle dove, flamingo, and various other exotic birds, showing the breadth and sophistication of Roman bird cuisine. Apicius provides detailed instructions including roast the bird, crush pepper, lovage, celery seed, sesame, parsley, mint, shallots, dates, honey, wine, broth, vinegar, oil, reduced must to taste. These weren't simple roasted bird recipes. They were complex culinary preparations involving multiple exotic spices, elaborate cooking methods, and artistic presentation techniques that required specialized knowledge and expensive imported ingredients. Small songbirds like thrushes and figpeckers were consumed entirely, because Romans believed eating the complete creature maximized the transfer of its musical and flying abilities. Little birds such as figpeckers, sparrows, thrushes, and ortolans were defeathered, then cooked whole. Singing birds are dipped in sauces or chopped up as a stuffing, showing Romans had multiple preparation methods for these creatures. Unlike larger birds where specific parts were selected, small songbirds were prepared and eaten completely. The French maintained this practice until 1999, when ortolan populations fell dangerously low, and hunting was banned, proving this Roman tradition influenced European cuisine for nearly 2,000 years. Romans thought that songbirds possessed the essence of music and flight throughout their bodies. So eating only the meat would waste the supernatural qualities contained within. Roman banquets were calculated spectacles of display, intended to demonstrate the host's wealth, status, and sophistication to guests. In the words of Catherine Raff, the Roman banquet was not merely a meal, but rather a calculated spectacle of display that was intended to demonstrate the host's wealth, status, and sophistication to his guests. The banquet was a chance to follow the precept of keeping your friends close and your enemies even closer, allowing emperors to display political power and wealth, and dispense valuable favors to the invitees while monitoring potential rivals. These gatherings served as networking opportunities to reward friends and punish enemies through subtle social positioning and menu choices. The menu served as an opportunity to demonstrate one's wealth and connections throughout the vast Roman Empire. Exotic produce, particularly those from wild animals, birds, and fish, were favored at elite dinner parties because of their rarity, difficulty of procurement, and consequent high cost, which reflected the host's affluence. Roman aristocrats competed through increasingly elaborate displays of rare foods imported from distant provinces, turning their dining rooms into stages for demonstrating their reach and influence across the known world. Serving common foods meant social disaster for wealthy Romans, while rare delicacies became the minimum standard for maintaining elite status among aristocratic circles. Regular poultry like chicken was considered inappropriate for aristocratic entertaining, regardless of preparation quality or seasoning sophistication. For the truly extravagant, unusual dishes such as peacock or flamingo might be served. The divide between social classes was starkly evident at feasts, where the rich and powerful would recline on plush couches, dining on rare delicacies from the far corners of the empire, while the poor, if they were invited at all, sat on stools or stood, eating simpler fare. The rarer and more expensive the species served, the higher the social status ranking it provided among Roman aristocratic society, creating endless competition for increasingly unusual ingredients from across the empire. Hosts played a game of one-upmanship by serving over-the-top dishes like parrot tongue stew and stuffed dormouse. This competition drove Romans to constantly seek foods that surpassed what their rivals had served at previous parties, where peacocks led to ostriches, which led to even more unusual species from distant provinces like flamingo tongues from Africa or nightingales from specialized farms. Social standing became directly tied to serving foods that other wealthy Romans had never seen or tasted before, pushing them to search the far reaches of their empire for new species, regardless of cost, logistics, or environmental consequences. You think their obsession with bird brains and flamingo tongues was bad? Wait until you hear about the sauce. Remember how wealthy Romans spent 3 years of a soldier's salary just to get their hands on this infamous fish sauce. They were completely addicted to the stuff, and here's why their craving was absolutely insane. Romans took fish guts, blood, and intestines, the parts every sane person throws away, mixed them with salt, and left them rotting in the Mediterranean sun for months until they turned into brown liquid. The smell was so revolting that cities banned production within their walls, yet somehow this became Rome's most beloved condiment. This wasn't just tolerance for an unpleasant smell. Romans genuinely loved the taste of liquefied fish guts. Romans used garum on absolutely everything, from meat dishes to desserts, proving no Roman meal was complete without rotting fish sauce. Garum appears in many recipes featured in the Roman cookbook Apicius, from lamb stew to chopped mallow leaves fried in a skillet. They put it in everything, including their desserts, with garum enhancing the flavor of dishes like pear and honey soufflé. A meal, no matter how grand or humble, seemed incomplete without the signature taste of garum. Premium garum saucerum cost 1,000 sesterces for 6 quarts, which represented more than 3 years of a Roman soldier's salary for what amounted to expensive rotten fish sauce. The best garum fetched extraordinarily high prices, with wealthy Romans paying astronomical amounts for superior fermented fish guts. To put this in perspective, Romans paid more for decomposed fish organs than most people earned in years of military service. Wealthy Romans considered premium garum a status symbol that demonstrated their refined palates, willingly paying fortunes for what was essentially liquid made from rotting animal intestines. Seneca called premium garum an expensive bloody mass of decayed fish with salted putrefaction. Yet even this harsh critic couldn't resist the Roman obsession with fermented seafood. Seneca specifically asked, "Do you not realize that garum saucerum, that expensive bloody mass of decayed fish, consumes the stomach with its salted putrefaction?" His description captures the fundamental contradiction of Roman garum addiction, intellectually recognizing it as disgusting while being unable to escape the cultural pressure to consume rotting fish sauce. Even critics who understood how revolting the concept was found themselves caught up in the empire-wide craze for decomposed fish organs. Romans developed sophisticated classification systems for garum based on fish species and fermentation methods, treating rotten fish sauce with the same reverence wine connoisseurs show for vintage bottles. Spanish mackerel garum was the most prized variety, with Romans able to distinguish between different grades of decomposed fish just by tasting. They created detailed hierarchies of rotting fish products, with certain coastal areas developing reputations for producing superior fermented fish sauce. Romans could identify the specific type of decomposed fish and the region of production just from the flavor, showing how deeply they had committed to their obsession with putrid seafood. These Romans were so obsessed with garum that Aulus Umbricius Scaurus became incredibly wealthy selling fermented fish guts, building a luxury house overlooking the sea with private bath suites from rotting fish profits. Scaurus owned and ran several garum workshops across Pompeii, with business concerns so significant that he delegated operations to multiple freedmen, because demand for decomposed fish sauce was absolutely insane. He was so proud of his putrid product that he put a mosaic of garum jars in his house entrance and labeled his containers finest fish sauce, literally bragging about selling liquefied fish organs to the Roman elite. The stench from garum factories was so overwhelming that Romans banned production from cities, yet somehow still craved the product enough to import it from distant coastal areas despite the transportation costs. The production of garum created such unpleasant smells that factories were generally relegated to the outskirts of cities. But wealthy Romans didn't care as long as they could get their fix of fermented fish sauce. The irony was staggering. Authorities passed laws prohibiting garum production near populated areas because the smell was unbearable. Yet Romans desperately wanted the end product delivered to their dinner tables. Romans built massive industrial complexes across the empire dedicated entirely to rotting fish. From Spain to Tunisia to Israel, proving their empire-wide addiction to decomposed seafood was a major economic driver. Archaeological evidence shows enormous facilities, like the Neapolis site in Tunisia with about 100 fermentation tanks, all devoted to the single purpose of making fish guts putrefy properly for Roman consumption. The scale was extraordinary. Entire coastal economies depended on convincing Romans that liquid made from rotting fish organs was not only edible, but essential for civilization. These operations employed approximately 50 workers per facility to tend vats of decomposing fish mixtures for months at a time. The production process took up to 3 months of deliberate decomposition, with workers carefully tending vats of rotting fish guts like they were precious wine, showing the incredible effort Romans invested in controlled decay. Workers layered fish entrails with salt and herbs, then waited months for the mixture to reach the perfect level of putrefaction before straining out the liquid for distribution. Romans developed sophisticated techniques for optimal fish decomposition, treating the controlled rotting process like a fine art that required expertise and patience. They invested enormous time and resources into perfecting the breakdown of fish organs, creating detailed procedures for achieving the ideal consistency of liquefied seafood. Even Roman soldiers received diluted hydrogarum as military rations, meaning the empire's armies marched on watered-down rotting fish sauce, proving no Roman could survive without fermented seafood. The military considered decomposed fish organs so essential that they created special diluted versions for troop distribution across the empire. Pliny noted that garum could be diluted to the color of honey wine and drunk, and this watered-down version called hydrogarum was distributed to Roman legions during campaigns. The empire's military might literally depended on keeping legions supplied with their beloved fermented fish sauce, no matter how disgusting it seems to modern sensibilities. Imagine yourself as a dinner guest at a wealthy Roman's house, and your host serves you what appears to be a perfectly normal egg dish. You take a bite, and suddenly your mouth is filled with something that feels like chewing on a rubber ball. Congratulations, you've just experienced the Roman delicacy of jellyfish. Apicius specifically describes serving sea nettles mixed with eggs, adding with obvious satisfaction that no one will know what they are eating. This wasn't accidental ignorance. This was deliberate deception designed to shock and horrify dinner guests. Romans ate jellyfish specifically for the revolting factor. The gelatinous, rubbery texture that makes most people gag was exactly what wealthy Romans found entertainingly disgusting. They mixed fish pâté with jellyfish for shock value at parties, competing over who could serve the most unusual and nauseating sea creature combinations to their unfortunate guests. The preparation required careful timing. Apicius instructs cooks to steam the jellyfish so that the jellyfish cannot combine with the eggs, and when they are dry, sprinkle with ground pepper and serve. Romans developed sophisticated techniques for making jellyfish as unpalatable as possible, while still being technically edible food. They didn't stop with jellyfish. Sea urchin spines found in Roman sewers at Herculaneum and Pompeii provide archaeological evidence of widespread consumption across social classes. The drains at the most expensive Pompeii properties contained traces of imported shellfish and sea urchins, marking these luxury sea creatures as clear indicators of elite social status. Sea anemones joined the underwater horror show, combined with sea urchins and mullet livers for maximum exotic impact. Modern Italian chefs still prepare spaghetti with sea anemones and sea urchins, continuing an ancient Roman tradition of eating things that look like they belong in a biology textbook rather than on a dinner plate. Romans also developed elaborate recipes for octopus and cuttlefish, which appear multiple times throughout the Apicius cookbook. They made isicia marina, seafood cakes from shrimps, lobster, cuttlefish, and squid mixed with elaborate spice combinations. The preparation involved grinding the seafood meat in mortars with pepper, lovage, cumin, and asafoetida, then shaping the mixture into cakes and cooking them until firm. Interestingly, the simplest octopus recipe shows Roman culinary wisdom: pepper, garum, laser. Serve. Sometimes they understood that quality ingredients needed minimal preparation. The Romans called octopus polypus because the modern word octopus wasn't invented until the 15th or 16th centuries by scientists attempting to classify sea creatures. They also farmed Mediterranean moray eels in seaside ponds specifically for banquets. Despite these being dangerous, potentially venomous creatures that could bite handlers, these morays were also kept as pets by some wealthy Romans and occasionally used as a means of punishment. The most infamous example was Vettius Pollio, who threw slaves to his moray eels as entertainment for dinner guests, including Emperor Augustus himself. When a slave broke a crystal goblet at dinner, Pollio ordered him thrown to the eels. But Augustus intervened by breaking all of Pollio's remaining goblets and demanding the slave be freed. Romans developed particularly cruel status practices around certain fish. Goatfish was considered the epitome of luxury, specifically because its scales exhibit a bright red color when it dies out of water. These fish were occasionally allowed to die slowly at the dinner table, and there was even a recipe where this death would take place directly in the garum sauce, combining cruelty with consumption for maximum social impact. The consumption of exotic sea creatures became another battlefield in Roman social warfare. Generally, serving fresh fish conferred higher status than preserved fish, but within the fresh category, rarity and difficulty of procurement determined your social ranking. Oysters were farmed at Baiae, a luxury resort town known for regional shellfish stews made from oysters, mussels, sea urchins, celery, and coriander. Emperor Vitellius created the ultimate sea creature status dish with his famous Shield of Minerva, composed of pike liver, brains of pheasant and peacock, flamingo tongue, and lamprey milt. The more exotic and expensive the sea creature, the higher the social points for serving it at elite dinner parties. Romans developed particularly cruel status practices around certain fish. Goatfish was considered the epitome of luxury, specifically because its scales exhibit a bright red color when it dies out of water. These fish were occasionally allowed to die slowly at the dinner table, and there was even a recipe where this death would take place directly in the garum sauce, combining cruelty with consumption for maximum social impact. Size mattered enormously. Large specimens of certain fresh fish commanded higher commercial and social value than smaller specimens. Marine fish was generally more sought after than freshwater fish because Romans valued the difficulty of procurement above actual taste. The general rule was simple: the more revolting the sea creature, the higher the status points for serving it. Wealthy Romans competed over who could present the most unusual and shocking sea creature combinations to their guests. Fresh fish commanded higher prices than preserved fish, but within the fresh category, rarity trumped everything else. Large specimens were more valuable than small ones, and marine fish consistently outranked freshwater varieties because of the transportation challenges involved in keeping them alive during long journeys to Roman markets. The Roman banquet functioned as a crucial power tool, where emperors and aristocrats could display political power and wealth through exotic seafood that demonstrated their reach across the empire's vast coastlines. Dinner guests competed to identify the most unusual sea creatures during banquet courses, turning meals into both culinary experiences and tests of sophisticated knowledge about revolting marine life. The competition became so intense that wealthy Romans were forced to seek increasingly bizarre creatures from the furthest reaches of the empire's coastlines. As Roman colonies provided seafood from Belgium to Mauritania to Pontus, let's talk about the moment when Roman food culture completely lost its mind. Picture wealthy Romans sitting around wondering how they could possibly shock their dinner guests next, and someone suggesting, "I know, let's eat mice." Not just any mice, mind you, but specially fattened, premium mice that cost more than most people earned in years. Romans discovered they could take tiny dormice, creatures about the size of squirrels, and turn them into the ultimate luxury food through sheer obsessive dedication to making everything as excessive as possible. These weren't regular house mice. They were edible dormice that could weigh up to 300 grams when properly fattened, which Romans achieved through what can only be described as rodent prisons designed for maximum weight gain. The Romans built special clay jars called glorarium specifically for fattening mice. These contraptions looked innocent enough from the outside, but inside they were carefully engineered mouse torture chambers. Archaeological excavations at Pompeii uncovered actual glorarium with acorn remains still inside, proving that Romans were so committed to fat mice that they built specialized rodent real estate with breathing holes, climbing shelves, and food delivery systems. The interior was polished smooth so the mice couldn't escape, and food trays could be refilled from outside without letting the prisoners exercise away their precious fat. The fattening process was methodical madness. Romans caught wild dormice during autumn when they were naturally fattest, then moved them to outdoor pens where they gorged on acorns, chestnuts, and walnuts. For the final fattening stage, they transferred the mice to glorarium containers where darkness induced artificial hibernation, causing rapid fat storage. Pliny noted that dormice particularly loved beechnuts, because apparently Romans were conducting detailed research into optimal mouse nutrition for dinner party purposes. Varro described wealthy Romans maintaining dormice farms alongside snails and bees, treating mouse fattening as serious agricultural business. The lengths they went to were absolutely insane. Titus Pompeius built a 4-square-mile hunting preserve in Gaul, specifically for breeding dormice, creating what was essentially an ancient mouse ranch designed to supply Roman dinner parties with premium rodents. When Romans decided their mice were fat enough, the preparation methods became even more bizarre. According to Apicius, dormice were stuffed with their own minced meat mixed with pork, pepper, pine nuts, laser, and liquamen, then sewn shut with thread before cooking. Imagine explaining to someone that you're stuffing a mouse with its own meat to make it more delicious. The cooking methods varied between roasting on clay tiles or boiling in broth, depending on whether you wanted crispy or tender mouse. Petronius provided the most famous description of how these rodent delicacies were served, noting dormice, rolled in honey and poppy seed on little bridges, soldered to the plate. These weren't just any serving dishes. Romans built special miniature bridges specifically for elevating honey-glazed mice above the dinner plate, making them appear to float in their sweet coating like tiny, expensive mouseboats. Romans ate the entire creature, bones and all, because apparently when you're committed to eating mice, you might as well commit completely. The dish was served during the gustatio, the appetizer course, alongside other luxury items, making fattened rodents the equivalent of modern cocktail party hors d'oeuvres. The mouse obsession became so extreme that Roman authorities felt compelled to intervene. In 115 BC, Consul Marcus Aemilius Scaurus passed sumptuary laws specifically prohibiting dormice consumption, along with exotic birds and mollusks, declaring them too luxurious even for Roman standards. This is a civilization that regularly ate peacock brains and flamingo tongues, yet somehow dormice crossed the line into excessive territory. The legal prohibition backfired spectacularly, making dormice even more desirable as forbidden delicacies. Wealthy Romans started serving them illegally, turning mouse consumption into an act of culinary rebellion that demonstrated both wealth and willingness to break laws for dinner party bragging rights. The competitive aspect reached absolutely ridiculous levels. Ammianus Marcellinus reported that hosts would weigh dormice on scales at banquets, with up to 30 scribes recording the weights and announcing them to guests. Picture this scene: 30 people with notebooks carefully documenting mouse weights, while dinner guests applauded heavier specimens. Romans turned rodent consumption into a sporting event where the fattest mice earned the most prestige points. The economics became equally insane. Marcus Aufidius Lurco earned 60,000 sesterces from his peacock and dormice breeding program, proving that Romans could build fortunes around fattening small animals for luxury consumption. Archaeological evidence suggests average farmers started raising dormice as profitable side businesses, creating an entire agricultural sector dedicated to producing premium rodents for wealthy Romans who couldn't get enough of this bizarre delicacy. Ancient gourmand Fluvius Hirpinus popularized the practice in the mid-1st century BC, essentially becoming the founding father of luxury mouse consumption. This represents the ultimate example of Roman social competition driving people to eat increasingly ridiculous things. Someone had to be first to suggest that what Roman dinner parties really needed was more expensive mice, and somehow everyone else decided this was brilliant. The pastio vellatica, as this small livestock farming was called, became a crucial part of villa economy that catered specifically to the luxury market. Wealthy Romans established elaborate operations combining dormice with snails and bees, creating diversified portfolios of unusual creatures designed to impress dinner guests. This wasn't just about food. It was about demonstrating that you had so much money and land that you could dedicate entire agricultural operations to producing absurd delicacies. What started as someone's crazy idea to eat hibernating mice evolved into an entire industry complete with specialized equipment, breeding programs, legal prohibition, competitive weighing, and fortunes made from rodent sales. Romans took the simple concept of eating small animals and transformed it into such an elaborate display of wealth and excess that the government had to step in and declare the whole thing too ridiculous even for Roman standards. The dormice phenomenon perfectly captures why Roman food culture was completely insane. They didn't just eat unusual things. They engineered entire systems around making unusual things as expensive, competitive, and excessive as possible. Only Romans could look at tiny hibernating mice and think, you know what this needs? Industrial-scale fattening operations, government regulation, and weighted competitions. The fact that this actually happened and that people made fortunes from it, reveals just how far Romans were willing to go when social competition met unlimited wealth and absolutely no sense of restraint. If Romans building mouse fattening factories wasn't crazy enough, they also decided that what their dinner parties really needed was farm-raised snails' force-fed milk, until they became too fat to retreat into their shells. This wasn't just occasional garden snail gathering. This was full-scale industrial snail production designed to create the most bloated mollusks possible for wealthy Roman consumption. Fulvius Lipinus became the founding father of commercial snail farming around 49 BC, establishing specialized operations at Tarquinia that would make modern livestock operations look simple. Lipinus didn't just raise local snails. He imported species from across the known world, bringing giant African snails called solitani alongside small white snails from central Italy, creating what was essentially a snail zoo dedicated to producing premium gastropods for Roman dinner tables. The preparation methods were absolutely demented. According to Apicius, Romans would remove the operculum, the flat door that snails use to seal their shells, before placing them in shallow vessels filled with milk. Without their protective door, the helpless snails couldn't withdraw into their shells, and their bodies would hang outside, growing unnaturally fat as they desperately consumed milk, trying to survive. Romans changed the milk daily and cleaned snail waste hourly, essentially running full-service gastropod spas dedicated to creating grotesquely oversized mollusks. The process took days of careful monitoring until the snails became so bloated they physically couldn't retract into their shells. Once the snails reached maximum fatness, Romans fried them in oil and served them with wine sauce, because apparently nothing says sophistication like creatures that died from forced milk consumption. Varro described elaborate snail pen designs with sophisticated irrigation systems to keep the mollusks properly hydrated during their fattening process. These weren't simple containers. They were engineered gastropod habitats with drainage systems and climate control, proving that Romans would apply serious agricultural engineering to any creature they wanted to eat, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. The snail obsession spread throughout the Roman upper classes, with wealthy families maintaining their own snail gardens featuring different species for different flavors. Some snails were fed sapa, the honey-like liquid produced by boiling grape juice, mixed with flour to enhance their taste. Others received diets of milk, bran, and bay leaves. Because Romans had developed sophisticated snail nutrition programs designed to optimize gastropod flavor profiles for discriminating palates. Fluvius Hirpinus popularized both snail and dormice farming around the same time, creating diversified small creature operations that supplied Roman dinner parties with an endless variety of bloated, fattened mini livestock. This represents the ultimate triumph of Roman agricultural innovation, applied to increasingly ridiculous purposes. Only Romans could look at garden snails and think, these need industrial-scale milk feeding operations and specialized breeding programs. The social competition aspect reached absurd levels when wealthy Romans began competing over who could serve the most elaborately prepared snails at their banquets. Serving garden-variety snails became socially unacceptable, forcing hosts to import exotic species and develop increasingly elaborate fattening techniques to impress their guests with superior gastropod quality. Roman exotic mammal consumption reveals the absolute peak of their food madness, when they started eating parts of animals that most civilizations would never consider edible, purely because they believed consuming exotic creatures would transfer magical properties to the consumer. This wasn't just about showing off wealth. Romans genuinely thought they could absorb animal superpowers through strategic consumption of unusual body parts. Emperor Elagabalus ate camel heels because he believed they would protect him against plague, demonstrating the teenage emperor's complete commitment to magical thinking about food. Picture the logistics involved in importing whole camels from Africa or Asia just to harvest their heels for imperial dinner parties. Then imagine the kitchen staff trying to figure out how to properly prepare camel feet for someone who thinks they'll gain disease immunity from eating hooves. The Roman physician Caelius Aurelianus specifically criticized the use of camel brain as a remedy for epilepsy, suggesting that Romans were regularly consuming camel neural tissue, believing it would cure neurological disorders. This reveals not just the exotic animal consumption, but the medical quackery that surrounded it, with Romans eating increasingly bizarre animal parts based on completely invented therapeutic benefits. Archaeological evidence from Roman middens confirms widespread consumption of exotic mammals, with camel bones found alongside the remains of other unusual creatures that Romans imported specifically for consumption. These weren't animals that wandered into Roman territory. They were deliberately captured, transported across vast distances, and butchered for elite dinner tables that demanded constant novelty in their protein sources. Romans consumed rabbits and hares not just as meat, but as symbols of fertility and sexuality, with the animals being sacred to Venus and Aphrodite. Wealthy Romans would exchange live hares as gifts between lovers, then presumably eat them afterward, combining romantic gestures with exotic dining in ways that only Roman culture could achieve. Varro described 3 distinct species of rabbits from Italy, Gaul, and Spain, proving that Romans were conducting detailed taxonomic research into optimal rabbit varieties for consumption. The elephant consumption represents perhaps the most extreme example of Roman exotic mammal madness. Emperor Probus served roasted elephant to guests at triumphal banquets, demonstrating that Romans would literally eat the largest land animals on Earth if it demonstrated sufficient imperial power. The logistics of transporting, slaughtering, and cooking elephants for dinner parties reveals the absolutely staggering resources Romans would dedicate to culinary showmanship. Bears, wild boar, deer, and other large mammals were regularly consumed at Roman banquets, but these represented the common exotic fare. The truly wealthy competed over more unusual creatures like wolverines, which appeared in Roman venations alongside zebras, giraffes, and hyenas. Romans created a complete entertainment-to-consumption pipeline for exotic creatures. The giraffe represents Roman exotic animal obsession at its most absurd. Julius Caesar famously introduced giraffes to Rome, where they captivated the public with their unusual appearance. But archaeological evidence suggests that wealthy Romans also consumed giraffe meat as the ultimate exotic delicacy. Imagine the kitchen challenges involved in butchering and cooking animals with 20-foot necks for dinner parties that demanded constant culinary innovation. Tigers, leopards, and other large predators weren't just arena entertainment. They were also consumed by wealthy Romans who believed eating dangerous animals would transfer their strength and ferocity. The Villa Romana del Casal mosaics depict the entire exotic animal supply chain, from capture in Africa and Asia to transport and consumption in Roman villas, proving that exotic mammal consumption was a massive commercial enterprise that spanned continents. The sheer variety of exotic mammals consumed by Romans is staggering. Archaeological and literary evidence documents consumption of everything from gazelles and crocodiles to monkeys and ostriches, revealing that Romans would literally eat any creature they could capture and transport, regardless of size, danger, or practical culinary value. This represents the ultimate expression of Roman wealth and power. The ability to turn the entire animal kingdom into a dinner menu that demonstrated complete dominance over both the natural world and the economic resources needed to acquire creatures from every corner of the empire. They reached peak food insanity when they decided that what their dinner parties really needed was pig reproductive organs prepared with the kind of obsessive attention usually reserved for religious ceremonies. This wasn't just about eating unusual animal parts. Romans developed elaborate theories about why consuming sow vulvas and udders would magically transfer fertility and sexual power to the people eating them. Sow vulva was considered the ultimate delicacy for fertility enhancement, with Romans believing that eating female pig genitalia would boost their own reproductive capabilities through sympathetic magic. The preparation process was absolutely demented. Romans specifically spayed their female pigs before slaughtering them or prevented them from having piglets to keep the reproductive organs pristine in both texture and taste. Picture Roman farmers managing pig breeding programs specifically designed to optimize genital quality for wealthy dinner tables. The Apicius cookbook detailed numerous recipes featuring this delicacy, often accompanied by udders and belly flesh, because apparently Romans thought mixing different pig reproductive parts would amplify the magical fertility effects. One preparation involved cooking sow womb in pepper, celery seed, dry mint, laser root, honey, vinegar, and broth, creating elaborate spice combinations designed to enhance the perceived supernatural properties of pig reproductive organs. Romans also grilled sow wombs after coating them in bran, afterwards put in brine, proving they had developed multiple cooking techniques for preparing pig genitalia depending on the desired texture and presentation. The fact that professional chefs were creating specialized cooking methods for reproductive organs reveals how mainstream this practice became among wealthy Romans, who genuinely believed they could absorb fertility powers through strategic consumption of pig parts. Udders represented another level of Roman reproductive organ obsession. These weren't just cooked and served, they were stuffed with spiced sea urchins and sewn shut before roasting, creating elaborate preparations that combined multiple unusual ingredients into single dishes designed to maximize both shock value and supposed magical benefits. Imagine Roman kitchen staff carefully sewing pig udders closed around sea urchin stuffing like they were preparing sacred ritual objects rather than dinner. The belief system behind sow reproductive organ consumption reveals Romans' complete commitment to magical thinking about food. They genuinely believed that eating specific animal parts would transfer those animals' characteristics to human consumers, turning dinner into a form of sympathetic magic, where reproductive organs could enhance human fertility and sexual performance through consumption. After pig reproductive organs, Romans escalated their aquatic obsessions to moray eels, which wealthy Romans kept in private ponds not just for food, but as instruments of entertainment, punishment, and social competition that would make modern serial killers seem restrained by comparison. Vettius Pollio became the poster child for Roman aquatic madness by maintaining pools of moray eels that he used to execute slaves who displeased him. When slaves broke rules, Pollio would throw them alive into eel ponds where the creatures would tear them apart while he watched for entertainment. The most famous incident occurred when Emperor Augustus was dining with Pollio, and a slave accidentally broke a crystal goblet. Pollio immediately ordered the slave thrown to his eels, but Augustus was so appalled that he ordered all of Pollio's expensive goblets smashed and the eel pool filled in. Multiple ancient sources confirm this story, with Seneca, Pliny the Elder, Cassius Dio, and Tertullian all documenting Palio's eel-based execution methods. The emotional attachment Romans developed to their eels reveals the psychological depths of their aquatic obsession. Antonia, Augustus's niece, kept a pet moray eel adorned with earrings. Marcus Licinius Crassus trained his pet eel to respond to its name and swim up to eat offerings, then wept when the creature died. Gaius Hurrius operated the first commercial eel farming operation, supplying 6,000 eels to Caesar for triumphal banquets, and eventually selling his estate for 4 million sesterces. Romans also prized lampreys, parasitic creatures valued for their blood and unusual appearance, with preparation methods involving soaking them in their own blood for days before cooking. The logistics of maintaining aquatic creature collections required massive expense and technical expertise. Yet wealthy Romans maintained elaborate eel operations to demonstrate their ability to afford the most exotic and dangerous aquatic delicacies available. Romans served eels live at banquets, creating dining experiences where guests could watch their food swimming before consumption. After moray eels and other aquatic delicacies, Romans turned their attention to something even smaller, tiny songbirds. Wealthy Romans would capture ortolans, thrushes, and other singing birds in specialized traps, then serve them whole at dinner parties. The preparation was beautifully simple and absolutely horrifying. These little creatures were defeathered, cooked whole, and eaten bones and all. Everything. The Romans believed that consuming songbirds would enhance their own musical abilities through sympathetic magic. So if you wanted to impress at the next poetry recital, you'd better crunch through some thrush bones first. What's fascinating is that recent archaeological evidence from Majorca shows thrushes weren't just elite food. Excavations at a Roman tavern found 165 thrush bones in a garbage pit, suggesting these songbirds were actually street food. The cooks would remove the sternum to flatten the birds, then quickly grill or pan-fry them, possibly serving them on skewers like ancient chicken wings. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Pliny the Elder documented recipes for fattening songbirds with figs before roasting. Imagine force-feeding tiny birds until they could barely move, all for a few bites of meat. Apicius included recipes for cooking these tiny birds in honey and wine, believing the sweetness enhanced their natural song-like qualities. The French continued this Roman tradition well into modern times. Ortolan hunting was banned in France in 1999, but the law was poorly enforced, and up to 50,000 ortolans were illegally killed each year. The practice involved blinding the birds to trick them into gorging themselves on grain and figs, then drowning them in Armagnac brandy before roasting. Some traditions die very, very hard. Wild rabbit represented another tier of Roman luxury that reveals just how far they'd go for status. While regular Romans might catch the occasional hare, wealthy households imported special game from across the empire. Wild rabbit was considered far superior to domestic varieties, with a more complex flavor that supposedly reflected the animal's freedom and natural diet. Hare preparation involved elaborate stuffing techniques that would make modern chefs weep. The Romans would stuff rabbits with their own minced meat mixed with expensive spices, nuts, and sometimes even smaller birds. It was like Russian nesting dolls, but with dead animals and significantly more expensive seasonings. Apicius ranked rabbit third in his hierarchy of meatballs, after peacock and pheasant, but before chicken. Venison arrived from Gaul in specially designed transport wagons, packed in snow and expensive spices to preserve it during the long journey south. The cost wasn't just in the meat itself, but in the logistics of moving fresh game across hundreds of miles before refrigeration existed. Romans were essentially paying premium prices for ancient express shipping. The regional specialties became status symbols themselves. Fine salted hams from Gaul were prized trade items, while Lucanian sausages made from ground meats, herbs, and nuts became luxury exports. Roman soldiers stationed in Gaul and Germania would hunt venison and wild boar when supplies ran low. But for wealthy Romans back home, these same animals represented the ultimate in exotic dining. Pheasant ranked alongside peacock in Apicius's cookbook, though it was slightly more accessible than flamingo tongues. Still, serving pheasant meant you had connections to game preserves and professional hunters. It was the Roman equivalent of serving Wagyu beef at a dinner party, except the Wagyu had to be hunted in a forest and transported by ox cart. Here's what made Roman dinner parties absolutely exhausting. Every single course was a social battlefield. Wealthy Romans competed relentlessly over who could serve the most elaborate small animal preparations. Serving common meat wasn't just boring, it was social suicide. Your menu was your power ranking, and everyone knew it. Guests would literally fight over who got to try the most unusual animal preparations during banquet courses. Imagine arguing over who gets the dormouse course versus the thrush course, while your host smugly watches knowing they've successfully created chaos through exotic food choices. It was like a prehistoric version of competitive Instagram posting, except instead of avocado toast, you were flexing with pickled songbird brains. The mathematics were brutal. The rarer and more expensive the animal, the higher your social ranking points as a host. Serving chicken was basically announcing that you were broke. Serving rabbit meant you had some money. Serving stuffed dormice meant you had serious wealth. Serving flamingo tongues meant you were either incredibly rich or incredibly stupid with money. What's truly fascinating is how this created an endless escalation of culinary absurdity. Each dinner party had to outdo the last one, which meant Roman hosts were constantly searching for more exotic, more expensive, more shocking animals to serve their guests. It was an arms race fought with deceased wildlife, and nobody could afford to lose. The pressure was so intense that some Romans, like our friend Apicius, literally bankrupted themselves trying to maintain their reputations as the ultimate food influencers. When Apicius realized he'd spent most of his fortune on rare ingredients, he committed suicide rather than live without access to the most exotic foods. That's how seriously Romans took their dinner party rankings. This competitive dining culture created a market for increasingly absurd delicacies. Professional hunters specialized in capturing specific rare animals for wealthy tables. Merchants made fortunes transporting exotic creatures across the empire. An entire economy developed around feeding Roman social competition with dead animals, which tells you everything you need to know about how completely insane Roman food culture had become. Remember Silphium, that mysterious herb I mentioned earlier that Romans literally ate into extinction? Time to dive deeper into this botanical tragedy, because the full story of how Romans destroyed an entire species for the sake of dinner reveals just how completely unhinged their food obsession had become. Silphium grew wild in a narrow strip of land in Cyrenaica, thought to have been approximately 201 kilometers by 40 kilometers in the area around the city of Eusperides. This was the only place on Earth where this magical plant would grow. During the reign of Julius Caesar, more than 1,000 pounds of the plant was stockpiled alongside gold in Rome's imperial treasuries, and Silphium saplings were valued at the same price as silver. Think about that for a moment. A plant was literally stored next to gold bars in the Roman treasury. But here's what makes Silphium's story so fascinating and tragic. Not quite as ubiquitous as liquamen, but just as necessary in the Roman kitchen, was the herb Silphium. This wasn't some occasional exotic ingredient, it was a kitchen staple for wealthy Romans. Apicius calls on Silphium in dozens of recipes throughout his cookbook, and even gives directions on how to stretch one's supply. Making a little laser go a long way, put the Silphium in a spacious glass vessel. Immerse about 20 pine kernels. If you need Silphium flavor, take some nuts, crush them. They will impart to your dish an admirable flavor. The Romans were so obsessed with Silphium that they developed elaborate techniques to make tiny amounts last longer. It's like having a spice so expensive that you store it with pine nuts to absorb the flavor. Then use the nuts instead. Imagine if saffron cost 10 times more than it does now, and you had to flavor your food with saffron-infused rice because actual saffron was too precious to use directly. This was Roman cooking at its most desperate and ingenious. Archaeological evidence shows that many Roman recipes from this period include Silphium as a standard ingredient. The cookbook attributed to Apicius contains Silphium in many of its documented recipes. From simple lentil dishes to elaborate Flamingo preparations, Silphium was the secret ingredient that elevated Roman cuisine from merely expensive to truly transcendent. Without Silphium, Roman haute cuisine was like French cooking without butter. Life in Cyrenaica revolved around Silphium to such an extent that the dramatist Antiphanes, in the 4th century BC, made one of his characters groan. I will not sail back to the place from which we were all carried away, for I want to say goodbye to all horses, Silphium, chariots, Silphium stalks, steeplechasers, Silphium leaves, and Silphium juice. Even ancient playwrights were making jokes about how completely Silphium-obsessed society had become. The plant had incredible versatility that drove Roman demand to insane levels. The Greeks grated it over food and cooked the stalk like a vegetable. The stems were roasted, the roots eaten with vinegar. The sap it produced, known as laser, was grated over foods and became the must-have condiment across the ancient Greek world. The ancient Egyptians used it for birth control, while sheep and goats fed with Silphium were said to produce more succulent meat. Many medical uses were ascribed to the plant that made it even more valuable. It was said that it could be used to treat cough, sore throat, fever, indigestion, aches and pains, warts, and all kinds of maladies. Hippocrates wrote detailed prescriptions using Silphium for various ailments. It was literally a miracle cure-all that also happened to be the most delicious seasoning in the ancient world. Modern medicine would call this too good to be true, but Romans believed they'd found the perfect plant. Here's where Roman greed sealed Silphium's fate. The Greeks tried to prolong its supply by regulating the amount of the plant's root that could be harvested at one time. Theophrastus describes the application of certain regulations during the harvest of Silphium juice. They have regulations, like those in use in mines, for cutting the root, in accordance with which they fix carefully the proper amount. This suggests that if enough of the root system was allowed to remain in the ground, the plant would recover. But inevitably, greed overcame good environmental stewardship. When Romans took control of Cyrenaica from the Greek colonists, they ignored these sustainable harvesting practices entirely. Roman provincial governors overfarmed Silphium and rendered the soil unable to yield the type that was said to be of such medicinal value. The Greeks understood that Silphium needed careful management, but Romans saw only immediate profit opportunities. Palynological evidence has shown that the range of plants present in this part of Libya changed in the 1st century CE, likely due to upland forest clearance to make more land for olive groves and cereal cultivation. Romans weren't just over-harvesting Silphium, They were destroying its entire ecosystem to plant more profitable crops. It's like cutting down a rainforest to plant corn, except the rainforest contained the only source of the world's most valuable spice. The final chapter of Silphium's story perfectly captures Roman attitudes toward irreplaceable treasures. Pliny reported that the last known stock of Silphium found in Cyrenaica was given to Emperor Nero as a curiosity. Roman author and naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote that within his lifetime, only a single stalk of the plant could be found. It was harvested and given to the Emperor Nero as a novelty around 54 to 68 AD. And what did Nero do with this precious final specimen, the last of its species on Earth? He ate it. Not preserve it for study, not attempt to propagate it, just consumed it immediately like any other snack. Some accounts suggest Nero simply popped it in his mouth without a second thought, treating the world's final Silphium plant like a piece of candy. This moment represents everything wrong with Roman food culture distilled into one tragic bite. This is Roman food culture distilled to its essence. They found something irreplaceably wonderful, and their first instinct was to eat it all until nothing remained. Its disappearance is considered the first recorded species extinction in history, caused entirely by human consumption. Romans didn't just create extreme luxury dining, they created the world's first human-caused extinction through pure culinary greed. When you wonder how Roman food got so completely insane, remember Silphium. They were so obsessed with eating that they literally consumed species out of existence, and then ate the final specimen as a curiosity. Aristocratic Romans added lead acetate, sugar of lead, believing it improved flavor and health, creating one of history's most dangerous luxury foods. Sapa and defrutum were made by boiling grape juice in lead vessels, concentrating the sweetness while unknowingly creating lead levels 200 times higher than modern safe limits. They thought they were creating the ultimate gourmet enhancement, but were actually manufacturing poison disguised as luxury. Must was reduced to half volume for defrutum or third volume for sapa, creating concentrated sweetness that Romans craved. The process involved boiling fresh grape juice in lead-lined vessels for hours until it reached the desired consistency. Sweet taste was actually lead poisoning disguised as luxury enhancement, but Romans had no way of knowing this deadly chemistry was occurring in their kitchens. Winemakers chose lead pots over brass because lead made a sweeter final product that customers preferred. Columelin noted lead pots were better than brass because brass vessels throw off copper rust with disagreeable flavor, while lead vessels produced pure, sweet results. The irony is that lead actually did make the wine taste better by neutralizing acidity and adding sweetness, which made the poisoning even more insidious because people genuinely preferred the taste. Lead acetate formed when acetic acid in wine bonded with lead from containers, creating the sweet flavor Romans loved. The chemical reaction that produced this sweetness was the same process that created the toxic compound. Every sip of sweetened wine was literally a dose of poison. But the taste was so appealing that wealthy Romans consumed it daily at dinner parties, unknowingly destroying their health one delicious cup at a time. These lead-sweetened wines weren't occasional treats, they were standard drinks at elite dinner parties. Wealthy Romans consumed dangerous amounts daily, up to 20 mg per day according to modern estimates. The more you could afford the sweetest, most refined wines, the more lead you were consuming. Status and poisoning went hand in hand, creating a tragic situation where wealth literally bought death. Modern research on Roman skeletal remains shows chronic poisoning across generations of wealthy families. A 2019 study found average 14.4 micrograms lead per deciliter in Roman London bones, while modern toxic level is 5 micrograms. Romans had nearly 3 times toxic levels in their bodies from this luxurious sweetener. The archaeological evidence reveals that entire aristocratic bloodlines were slowly dying from their refined taste in wine. Garum and recreated Roman sapa using ancient methods and found 241,000 mg lead per liter. 1 teaspoon of Roman sapa contained enough lead to cause chronic poisoning. Yet Romans were drinking goblets of wine sweetened with this substance at every fancy dinner party. The wealthy were literally poisoning themselves with what they considered the height of sophisticated taste, creating a feedback loop where the richest Romans were also the most poisoned Romans. After all this talk about Romans sweetening their wine with poison, you might wonder what actually happened to these wealthy gourmets who were unknowingly destroying themselves one delicious sip at a time. The answer reveals the ultimate irony of Roman food culture. The more exquisite your taste, the more likely you were to go completely insane. This wasn't just individual madness, it was systematic self-destruction through gourmet dining. Picture Emperor Claudius, who ruled from 41 to 54 AD and was described as dull-witted and absent-minded. According to historical accounts, he had disturbed speech, weak limbs, an ungainly gait, tremor, fits of excessive and inappropriate laughter and unseemly anger, and he often slobbered. Modern researchers looking at these symptoms see classic signs of lead poisoning, but Romans just thought he was naturally clumsy and eccentric. Then there's Caligula, whose name has become synonymous with excessive cruelty and madness. He was a chronic alcoholic who apparently appointed his horse as a priest and believed he was a deity. After a severe illness at age 25, he transformed from a beloved young emperor into a paranoid monster who would sentence people to death for minor slights. Some historians suggest this illness might have been lead poisoning from his excessive wine consumption, combined with the concentrated sapa that wealthy Romans adored. Tiberius, who ruled before Caligula, was nicknamed Biberius for his love of wine, and was described as schizophrenic with severe mood swings that worsened over his reign. Emperor Nero presents another fascinating case of lead-induced madness disguised as imperial privilege. He would cover himself in wild animal skins, run into arenas, and brutally mutilate people for entertainment. Historical accounts describe him as having violent mood swings and making increasingly irrational decisions. Nero reportedly wore a breastplate of lead as he fiddled and sang while Rome burned, literally surrounding himself with the very poison that may have been destroying his mind. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you realize that roughly 2/3 of Roman leaders who ruled between 30 BC and 220 AD showed what Garum and described as a predilection for lead-tainted wines. These weren't occasional indulgences. Wealthy Romans were consuming 1 to 5 liters of wine per day, much of it sweetened with lead-based sapa or served in lead-lined vessels. The scale of consumption at elite banquets was legendary, representing almost incomprehensible levels of luxury and excess. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning perfectly match what Roman historians described as typical aristocratic behavior. Lead affects brain chemistry by substituting for calcium in neural processes, causing either too much or too little signaling between neurons. This can result in erratic mood swings, impaired judgment, memory problems, and the kind of grandiose thinking that might make you believe appointing a horse to government positions is perfectly reasonable. The very word Saturnine, meaning gloomy and cynical, comes from Saturn, the Roman god associated with lead and describes the personality changes that lead poisoning creates. The wealthy weren't just going mad individually. They were experiencing what modern medicine would recognize as an epidemic of neurological damage. The lead concealed in the food and wine they devoured led to unprecedented epidemics of saturnine gout and sterility among aristocratic males, and alarming rates of infertility and stillbirths among aristocratic women. Julius Caesar, for all his sexual adventures, was unable to produce more than one known offspring. Caesar Augustus, his successor, displayed not only total sterility, but also a cold indifference to sex that worried his contemporaries. The very lifestyle that marked them as sophisticated was systematically destroying their bloodlines. Modern skeletal analysis has revealed the shocking extent of this poisoning. Recent studies show that Roman-era skeletons contained 8 to 123 micrograms of lead per gram, compared to Iron Age skeletons, which had only 0.3 to 2.9 micrograms per gram. That's up to 400 times more lead in Roman bones, absolutely enough to be messing with brain chemistry on a massive scale. What makes this tragedy even more poignant is that Romans actually knew lead was dangerous, but only in large doses. Ancient physicians like Hippocrates had observed that miners and metalworkers who handled lead directly suffered terrible symptoms. Pliny the Elder wrote that workers painting ships with white lead wore loose bags over their faces to avoid breathing noxious dust. But the slow, chronic poisoning from gourmet food was invisible to them. They associated the symptoms with natural aging, stress from ruling an empire, or divine displeasure, never connecting their refined palates to their declining health. The ultimate irony is that the Roman pursuit of culinary perfection created a feedback loop of destruction. The wealthiest Romans, who could afford the most refined and sweetest wines, were also consuming the highest levels of lead. Their erratic behavior then influenced imperial policy, military decisions, and governance of the entire empire. The very people who should have been making the wisest decisions were slowly having their judgment systematically compromised by their sophisticated palates. Roman food culture didn't just create extreme luxury, it created an empire ruled by the cognitively impaired, all in the name of exquisite taste. The dangerous and excessive living continued downward through the upper ranks of the social hierarchy, creating a cascade of poisoned decision-makers throughout Roman society. Black pepper was worth its weight in silver, literally transforming Roman cuisine into the world's first luxury spice obsession. According to Pliny the Elder, 1 Roman pound of white pepper cost 7 denarii in the year 77 AD, while black pepper cost 4 denarii. To put this in perspective, that made white pepper more expensive than many wines and luxury foods. Romans were essentially paying the equivalent of precious metal prices for tiny dried berries from India. The scale of Roman spice addiction was absolutely staggering. The Greek geographer Strabo claimed that during the time of the early Roman Empire, a fleet of 120 ships was sent to India on an annual basis to bring spices, including pepper, to Rome. This wasn't occasional trading. It was an industrial-scale operation that used monsoon winds to transport massive quantities of spices across the Arabian Sea. The Romans built special warehouses called Horia Pipertaria in 92 AD solely to store pepper, showing just how important this single spice had become to their food culture. When Alaric and his Goths sacked Rome in 410 AD, they captured 27 pounds of pepper from the city's stores. Think about that for a moment. Rome was stockpiling over 3,500 pounds of pepper like it was a strategic military resource. The fact that barbarian invaders considered pepper valuable enough to haul away tells you everything about how completely Romans had transformed this spice, from seasoning into currency. Cinnamon and cassia bark arrived from Sri Lanka for wealthy households, while saffron from Greece colored and flavored the most expensive dishes. Long pepper was actually more prized than black pepper due to its rarity, creating a hierarchy of spice snobbery that would make modern food critics blush. Romans paid premium prices for ginger preserved in honey, which served both medicinal and culinary purposes at their elaborate banquets. The spice trade created its own criminal underworld of food fraud. Con men would blend expensive black peppercorns with cheap juniper berries to increase their profits, while others mixed ground pepper with lead powder or lead ash to increase the weight and make more money. Romans were so obsessed with authentic spices that they created an entire economy of counterfeit seasonings, proving that food fraud is as old as luxury dining itself. Marcus Gavius Apicius was Rome's ultimate food influencer, a wealthy gourmand who lived during Emperor Tiberius's reign and literally spent himself to death pursuing culinary perfection. This wasn't just someone who enjoyed good food. Apicius was so obsessed with ingredients that he once sailed all the way to Libya to eat some much-praised prawns, only to turn around and sail home without even tasting them, because they didn't meet his impossibly high standards. Apicius established a cooking school and served as inspiration for a whole host of later cooking schools, essentially creating the world's first celebrity chef empire. His colossal banquets were legendary even by Roman standards, featuring dishes so elaborate and expensive that they eventually drove him to bankruptcy. When he realized he'd spent most of his fortune on rare ingredients and couldn't maintain his lifestyle, he committed suicide rather than live without access to the most exotic foods. That's the ultimate food obsession taken to its logical extreme. The cookbook attributed to Apicius, De Re Coquinaria, became the Bible of Roman haute cuisine and established the template for competitive luxury dining. The recipes weren't meant for home cooks, but for professional chefs working in wealthy households, creating a culinary arms race where each dinner party had to outdo the last one. Modern food scholars compare Apicius not to practical cookbooks like Joy of Cooking, but to the conceptual works of famous chefs like Ferran Adrià, designed to push the boundaries of what's possible rather than feed families. Apicius promoted both silphium and lead ingredients in his recipes, spreading dangerous practices throughout the upper classes permanently. His recipes featured sapa, the grape syrup that Romans unknowingly contaminated with lead during preparation, and included silphium as a standard ingredient before it went extinct. He wasn't just documenting Roman food culture, he was actively shaping it and making it more extreme, more expensive, and ultimately more deadly. The social competition that Apicius inspired created a cascade of culinary madness throughout Roman society. Wealthy Romans competed over who could serve the most elaborate preparations featuring his techniques and ingredients. Having access to Apicius-style recipes became a mark of social status, while failing to keep up with his innovations meant social suicide at elite dinner parties. Apicius's influence extended far beyond his lifetime, with his name becoming synonymous with luxury dining for centuries. The cookbook continued to be copied and circulated long after his death, spreading his philosophy that no expense was too great for perfect flavor. Roman aristocrats bankrupted themselves trying to emulate his legendary banquets, creating a culture where culinary sophistication was measured by how much money you could waste on a single meal. The ultimate legacy of Apicius was transforming Roman dining from sustenance into competitive performance art. His recipes required ingredients from across the empire, professional staff to execute them, and unlimited budgets to source the rarest components. What started as one man's obsession with perfect food became an empire-wide competition that literally poisoned the ruling class with lead and drove species to extinction in pursuit of the ultimate dining experience. The Roman luxury food obsession created the world's first systematic environmental destruction for dining pleasure. They didn't just consume exotic ingredients, they consumed entire species out of existence and poisoned themselves in pursuit of culinary perfection. Modern food trends seem almost quaint compared to Romans eating themselves into extinction and systematically destroying their own minds with lead-sweetened wine. Today's food culture shows disturbing parallels to Roman excess, from luxury ingredients flown across the globe to social media food competitions that prioritize spectacle over sustenance. We see echoes of Roman spice obsession in modern luxury restaurants that charge premium prices for rare ingredients. And the same social competition that drove Romans to bankruptcy now plays out on Instagram with elaborate food displays designed purely for status. A recent survey found that 69% of millennials and Gen Z diners photograph their meals before eating, transforming food into performance art, just as Romans did with their elaborate banquets. Social media has created the digital equivalent of Roman dinner party competition, where visual appeal often matters more than taste or nutrition. Modern chaos cakes and edible gold dishes mirror Roman peacock brain presentations, designed not for flavor, but for shock value and social media virality. The rise of Instagram-worthy dishes with gold leaf, rainbow colors, and over-the-top presentations directly parallels how Romans served flamingo tongues and peacock brains, prioritizing visual impact and rarity over actual culinary merit. The real question Romans force us to ask is, what dangerous food trends are we creating now with our global reach and technology? Climate change from food transportation, overfishing of luxury species like bluefin tuna for high-end sushi, and the environmental cost of maintaining year-round availability of exotic ingredients all mirror the Roman pattern of prioritizing immediate gratification over long-term consequences. Modern restaurant culture's emphasis on rare, expensive ingredients flown across continents echoes how Romans bankrupted themselves importing spices and exotic animals purely for status. Roman food culture demonstrates what happens when unlimited wealth meets social competition and magical thinking about what we consume. Their belief that eating exotic animals transferred powers, that rarer ingredients meant better health, and that expense equaled quality created a feedback loop of increasingly destructive consumption that we can recognize in modern wellness trends and luxury food marketing. Today's superfood obsessions, expensive detox ingredients, and belief that rare or exotic foods provide special health benefits all echo Roman magical thinking about food. The most chilling parallel is how Romans knew lead was dangerous, but continued consuming it because the taste was irresistible and socially expected. Today we face similar choices with foods we know cause health and environmental problems, but continue consuming because they're convenient, trendy, or socially expected. The Roman example suggests that knowing something is harmful doesn't guarantee we'll stop doing it, especially when the pleasure is immediate, the social pressure is strong, and the consequences feel distant. So here we are, having wandered through the bewildering landscape of Roman food obsession, where emperors ate themselves into madness and entire species vanished into aristocratic stomachs. We've seen how the pursuit of the perfect meal created the world's first luxury food culture, complete with social competition, environmental destruction, and systematic self-poisoning, all in the name of exquisite taste. Thank you for joining me on this gentle journey through the stranger corners of history. Until we meet again in another time and place, may your appetites be guided by wisdom rather than status. And may you remember that sometimes the most refined tastes come with the highest costs.